Welcome to the T2 Hubcast. Join Martin, Dave, Spencer and guests as they discuss all things personal and professional development. The T2 Hubcast, brought to you by the People Performance People.
So welcome to the T2 Hubcast with me, Martin Johnson.
Me, Dave Pendleton.
How are you doing, David?
I'm all right. You?
Yeah. It's raining. It's a bit miserable after a wonderful spring so far, but hopefully the summer will be good. So Dave, we've had a request from a customer for a podcast. And that request is on a particular topic that actually we get quite a lot of questions asked around. It comes up a lot in our client sessions and actually more so in the one-to-ones that we do, around coaching and development. And it's the topic of imposter syndrome. Now, imposter syndrome, I think everybody likes at a high level, tries to understand it, gets the general gist of it. But what is imposter syndrome? Is it common? Do a lot of people suffer from it? And if so, is there something you can do about it, et cetera, et cetera? And I think what we'll just do, Dave, is discuss it all on this podcast, nice and relaxed, see where it goes.
Cool.
So imposter syndrome, let me kick us off by giving you my definition, or the general understood definition in psychology around imposter syndrome. Imposter syndrome is sort of like when you are being like the swan. It's when you are externalizing yourself to the world as, I'm doing okay, I am successful, I'm rising the ranks, I'm seemingly doing okay in my personal life, my career, I have a nice house, a family, I drive nice cars, I have a decent career, I have income, I'm working my way up, or whatever it might be. But on the inside of your mind, of you, it doesn't feel like that. You have this inner fear that you ain't good enough. How have you got yourself to this position? Are you going to get found out? It's only a matter of time and I'm out my depth. And I think that is probably the best way to describe imposter syndrome. It's when a human being, what they feel on the inside about themselves is not always mirroring what they are portraying on the outside. And it's this mass fear of being found out, of not being good enough. It's almost like you're not giving yourself the credit for the things you've achieved in life and where you're at. Dave, I'll come straight to you on this. We see this a lot in people who have risen up the organizations, who positions of either leadership, command, or authority, or just influence in significant positions. They now have a voice and they have, they're accountable for a certain level of performance. And they just constantly doubt themselves, whether they're good enough, how they're being viewed, how they're being observed, etc. It's quite common, Dave, isn't it?
It is, yeah. And as you rightly suggest, we come across it quite a bit in the one-to-ones because it's a very difficult thing to admit to anyone else, even though you probably have got some sort of idea about what's going on inside, even though you might not be able to give it a label. It does seem much more common now that people are able to label these feelings of doubt and lack of confidence. And I think the biggest thing for me about this whole piece, Martin, is it's about perspective. Because quite often, as you rightly say, people who experience and, worse still, suffer at the hands of imposter syndrome are quite often deemed by their friends and colleagues at work as being very successful, as being very competent and capable, being excellent leaders, whatever it might be. It's they themselves doubt their ability to do that. And I think that's the key. It's about perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. And I also think there's two takes on this, right? Because the first thing to say is imposter syndrome is not a condition that some people suffer from and some people don't. Imposter syndrome is an entirely human response to the fear of failure, the fear of not being good enough or not getting things right. And as we'll come on to, Dave, there are certain people who are wired in certain ways who will be more susceptible to imposter syndrome than others. However, I maintain every human being on the planet could suffer from this in the fact that we can all feel like we're winging it on the surface, right? Where and on the inside we don't feel as assured and confident about something as what we might be showing, right? We all have that. However, there are two types of people with this. Let's take me, for example, and you might come under the same bracket. I look at that situation where I'm confident on the surface but feel like I'm winging it on the inside. I look at that as a general positive. I'm like, listen, you fake it till you make it, right? The only way I'm going to become confident on the inside is to do it so many times on the surface that I form a habit of it. So I view it as my inner worry or insecurity at this time is part of the process. It's part of progress. I'm going to grow by not being sure about things, by trying new things, and then only in time will the confidence on the inside mirror it, right? So I use that to my advantage, whereas some people, it's how you interpret that vulnerability on the inside, isn't it? It's how you interpret. If you fear being vulnerable in the first place, it's going to actually fuel imposter syndrome. If you're absolutely okay with being vulnerable, it's going to counteract it. So I think the ability to be vulnerable and being open about actually vulnerability is part of progress, it's part of growth, is a huge important point on imposter syndrome. It's those who try to suppress it because they feel like being vulnerable is weak and therefore the fear of being found out grows even greater. That's the ones who it tends to cause a problem with. Would you agree with that, Dave?
Yeah, and it sort of feels to me as though we're drifting into psychological safety there, Martin.
Yeah.
And of course, this is a topic we started talking about quite a lot recently. And I suppose on one of the podcasts that we did a little while ago around psychological safety, I think we even mentioned imposter syndrome. This is where this can start to live. And like you say, that's the fear of exposure, the fear of demonstrating vulnerability, even though that's not necessarily the case. So I think it definitely, for me, it's the whole thing about other people's perception and your own perspective of your abilities and capabilities. Yeah. Absolutely, it is.
And there are some people who are going to be more susceptible to this for different reasons. So it's easy for me to sit here and say, I actually grow in my life and career through a bit of imposter syndrome and being like the swan. I actually go, you've got to try new things and fake it till you make it. But that's because I'm driven by things where to succeed and achieve is really important to me. To go and have a go and take risks is really important to me. And therefore, I don't mind the vulnerabilities that come with that. I don't mind holding my hand up and go, well, that didn't work, sure. Right? Whereas some people are driven in different ways, aren't they, Dave? Like, let's take, we do a lot of work on print. Let's take the perfectionist. So I think people who are overly perfectionistic about things have a higher chance of suffering from imposter syndrome because their greatest fear is for things not being absolutely perfect and to the standard and quality that they perceive other people need. And therefore, anything that's not perfect starts to make them doubt themselves, which that's when imposter syndrome starts to come up. So I don't have a perfectionistic drive, Dave. I don't have a perfection. You're probably smiling as you're thinking, really? But I don't have, fundamentally, I don't have this perfectionistic, everything has to be like this primary drive. So it doesn't overly play havoc with me. And you don't really, to an extent. Sometimes me and you are okay with leaving some room for things to either not be complete or to can evolve in time, or we can change it, or it might, So I think if you're out there listening to this and you suffer from imposter syndrome, ask yourself this first question, Dave. Are you a perfectionist? Because I don't know if you would agree, but I think they have a higher susceptibility to imposter syndrome than some others.
Well, it's an interesting point you make, and I experienced this very conversation with a group of guys that I was working with last week. And we did indeed have somebody on the virtual call who had a combination through print that is entirely around perfectionism. It was the knowledgeable and smart, perfect, correct, and right. And as we know, that is the most, that's the combination that drives standards and perfection and all the rest of it more than any other combination. And interestingly, when the group was sharing their results and sharing their thoughts and feelings and so forth, this sort of theme came up from this particular person. And it was really interesting that one of his colleagues actually stopped him halfway in his tracks and said, yeah, but do you know what? your 80% from your own perception is most of ours 120%. It's and that's how it is. You beat yourself up about not being able to do X, X, and X. It's and we're more than happy with even half of what you've just given us because it fits, it suits the need, it helps us achieve what we need to achieve. And compared to what other people put out, it's over and above what some of us might even expect. And that again brings me back down to the self-perception thing and rightly say what you say in terms of the perfectionism, because if it's that all or nothing mentality, then it's always going to be a very difficult thing to achieve. Achieving all is very, very difficult.
Yeah.
And if it's not all, it's nothing.
Yeah.
And that's when people beat themselves up.
No, you make a really good point. So perfectionism really has the ability to fuel imposter syndrome because their greatest fear is things not being perfect, having any little dents, any little mishaps, anything that they deem as not being right. They feel so perfectionists feel like other human beings spot the same things they spot.
Yeah.
And the reality is,
They don't
Dave,
at all.
nobody spots what the perfectionist
don't.
spots.
No.
So the perfectionist starts to gather imposter syndrome and build imposter syndrome based on something that actually other people are highly likely to never even notice. Yeah.
Right.
But in your mind, you're thinking, if I can see it, they can see it. And that's where the self-doubt and the worry comes in. The second one I'm going to throw in the mix, Dave, and I'll throw it over to you, is this. So if the perfectionist suffer from imposter syndrome because they fear the outcomes and tasks and activities being not perfect, there's also a humanistic side to imposter syndrome. So I see a lot of people, and we can link it to print again, Dave, but I see a lot of people suffer from imposter syndrome when they don't want to let others down. So the humanistic 6-2, like the safe and secure, the needed and appreciated type motivators, they sometimes suffer inner self-doubt because their greatest fear is letting other human beings down or feeling like another person can't depend on them. So they put an awful lot of pressure on themselves from a humanistic perspective to deliver outcomes for others. Now, just like the perfectionist is fighting the losing battle on everything being right and perfect, the letting people down, the humanistic imposter syndrome, is also an impossible task because you can't be all things to all people, Dave. And you can't get it 100% of the right and please everybody all the time. So when people go up into leadership positions and they have this imposter syndrome driven by the fear of letting people down, the more people that rely on them, the greater the imposter syndrome becomes, because they're trying desperately not to let people down. People's comments in meetings, what people think of them, everything starts to matter tenfold to people who don't want to let other people down. So there's a humanistic side to imposter syndrome as well as the perfectionist side, isn't there?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you started to touch on a really important point for me about that, particularly that motivator, and that's in some people we almost see this paranoia of what other people think of them, because they're always trying to project themselves to the outside world as positive, helpful, trustworthy, honest, and so on and so forth. So if ever they feel as though they're not projecting all of that, those different levels of positivity and amazing human traits, then that's when it starts to create doubt. And, I experienced that as well. Not in myself, but certainly in one or two people close to me, they are constantly aware of what others think of them. And that creates instant, immediate internal self-doubt.
Yeah. And it's a self-perpetuating cycle, because what happens is the more you worry about what people think, the more you overcompensate on your external behavior. So quite often, right, the people who smile the most, who project the most, who seemingly on the surface is great to be around and all the rest of it, they're overcompensating, and it grows tiresome, because then when they retract to the safe space, it's like peaks and troughs. They then start worrying about if they're doing enough and what people think. So then they overcompensate again externally. And this is what I talk about in the confidence conundrum video and the stuff that we do. When what you externalize to the world, when your surface confidence is far greater than your inner self-confidence, when there's a misalignment between them two, that is where imposter syndrome thrives. And vice versa. When your inner self-confidence is high and you're not projecting it to the world, you worry for a different reason. But imposter syndrome comes from the first scenario. High surface confidence, you're projecting and overcompensating so much, but then you doubt yourself on the inside so much in your personal or private space that you start to really fuel imposter syndrome. And the key to it, Dave, really, is you've got to align them. And only in vulnerability lies the answer to alignment. Only when you are willing to say, listen, I worry loads about what people think about me. I am always worried whether this is right or not. And, it's just me. And, I need some validation for these reasons. When you actually have the confidence just to align them and say, what I project is what I feel, the good, the bad, or the ugly, that's the first steps to solving imposter syndrome. And the problem for people who are either humanistic and worried about letting people down or the perfectionist is that their biggest fear is looking weak or letting people know that's how they feel. So it's the biggest step to take. But anybody listening to this at this point, we're 15 minutes in, if you're suffering from either of the scenarios Dave and I have spoken about, you have to align your surface and inner self-confidence, which means what you portray to the world has to be what you feel inside. And if that is vulnerability and self-doubt, then so be it. That is the start of counteracting imposter syndrome. What else from you, Dave? Who else could suffer from imposter syndrome apart from the perfectionist or the person who fears letting people down?
Well, I think it's those people as well who try to sort of demonstrate that really high level of external strength when potentially it's their environment that demands it from their own perspective.
Yes. So I can speak from experience on this one. As someone who likes to do that anyway. And I think that's the one reason why I don't suffer from imposter syndrome with this, because I'm wired in a way to get fulfillment from it, right? However, I can resonate at times, Dave, because I'm only human, that I'm a strong character. I know I'm driven with strong motivators and I run the company. There is definitely a sense when you put all that in the melting pot, when you're responsible for livelihoods, for customers, for, family, everything. When it's on your shoulders every day and you are acting like the superheroes, keeping it all together, even the most strong of people, even the most driven of people get to a point where that constant turning up, projecting, I've got the ship, don't worry, I'll shoulder the burden, that grows testing and tiresome for the most strong of people. It does. And sometimes I sit back, Dave, and reflect and go, am I mad? Have I actually got all this? All these balls that are spinning, And the answer to that for me is very quickly followed by, yeah, of course you have.
Yeah.
But not everybody's not everybody's wired in that way. So what you're saying here is people who carry great responsibility and who are shouldering that burden constantly of either leadership or responsibility and accountability, imposter syndrome can very quickly creep in.
Yeah, and I think the interesting point here to make is that they are carrying that heavy weight because they think they should or think they have to. When actually, if they just asked a few more questions, demonstrated a bit more vulnerability, they'd probably find out that maybe the whole responsibility is not theirs to carry.
Do you know what? You do this. You've done this a few times. So there's been a couple of times over the years where even for me, I start to go, gee, where are we going with this? And is it possible? And can we do this? And there's a couple of times we've had conversations and you go to me, Martin, listen, I've got your back. I'll take it on. I'll take that. You don't need to do that. I've got it covered. Why don't you do this? And honestly, the relief in me when I go, oh, thank God he said that. There you go, Dave. Over to you.
Yeah.
But
it's counterproductive for my workload, generally speaking.
Your point being is the perception that you have to carry everything and do everything is the skewed perception.
Absolutely.
Because actually, if you've got people around you, the right people, they are more than willing to take stuff off you.
Yeah, absolutely.
You don't have to be the one who controls everything, who drives everything, who carries the burden for everything. And actually, those moments where I can offload to you or you take stuff on or whatever, and I don't have to worry about it anymore, that's enough for me to reset.
Yeah.
So I guess if there's a leader listening to this who's maybe suffering a little bit from it and you feel a bit isolated and alone, ask yourself the question, are you absolutely utilizing the people around you?
That's right, yeah.
But to do that, Dave, it comes back to being vulnerable.
Of course.
You have to admit to people that you're sinking.
Yeah.
I can't do all this. Because people will go, I know you bloody can't. I'm watching you. Now, what can I do for you?
Yeah.
It is a really good point, that. Delegation and offloading and empowering and entrusting is an answer to the superhero who's starting to struggle with imposter syndrome.
Yeah, absolutely it is. Yeah.
So I think, at this point, it's worth mentioning and just recapping on a few things, Dave, before I bring you in, is this. Imposter syndrome isn't a condition that's reserved and diagnosed to certain people. All human beings are driven by survival and away from risk by their nature, which means at times we can all encounter situations that we're uncomfortable with, not experienced in, or we feel inner self-doubt around. And we can doubt our abilities, and therefore anybody can suffer from imposter syndrome, and we all have to different degrees at different levels. However, what we've explored is that some people are more susceptible to others from suffering from imposter syndrome on a more regular basis. And that is very much around, well, we talked about three things. We've talked about those who are perfectionists and who suffer because they want everything to be perfect and right. And if it's not, they fear that other people can see what they can see. The answer to that is they very rarely can. And it's a perception thing. The second people who can suffer regularly are people who feel letting others down, the humanistic side of imposter syndrome. And that is because you're trying to be all things to all people, and your perspectives, again, are not aligned. And the last one we talked about there is the superhero, the person who shoulders a lot of responsibility and accountability. This often happens as you rise up the chain and you have that moment and go, Jesus, I'm running an X million pound business with 3,000 people and I'm on the hook for it. Oh my God, how did I get here and can I do it, right? So those who shoulder responsibility, those who take everything on themselves tend to start to suffer. And the answer to that lies in delegation and vulnerability. What else, Dave? What else have you got on imposter syndrome that we haven't discussed?
I guess just a little bit of commonality that I see is that it tends to be when people have been newly promoted, that there's been a period of reflection and they feel as though this thing is far too big for their skills and abilities. Some people kind of reflect and think they've got no clue how they got there because they've got no idea about their own competencies and capabilities. They've never been through processes of measuring just how good they are and getting that level of feedback, I suppose. And I suppose they're the two places that I come across it the most when doing one-to-ones. And I felt it as well. I wouldn't say, because I guess there's two different ways that people can feel it. And I think I experienced it, but I didn't suffer it, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So I felt it. I understood it. I understood what it was. I didn't know what the name or anything was at the time, because this many years ago, but I experienced it and it made me feel uncomfortable. I didn't like it. But I was in a position where I actually had no choice but to get over it because I was traveling halfway across the world working on my own. So I had no choice, than just to get on with stuff and get past it, which I did, thankfully. But I guess, if it perpetuates further and further, that's when it starts to create problems for people. So I guess maybe some thoughts about how we can get past it might be a good idea.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's also those people, Dave, where sometimes I ask people who go through 5 years of a degree to get their piece of paper and their qualification in a certain area. And I ask them why they've done that. And they go, and it's partly to get over imposter syndrome. Because if that piece of paper says I'm qualified, I'll feel better about it.
Yeah, right.
And my answer to that is, but whilst you've been at university for 5 years and someone else has been in the wicket doing the job for 5 years, who's more experienced, the piece of paper or the person, right? So don't get me wrong, I'm not downplaying education and the importance of how that, but some people only and solely need it to make them feel like they're qualified, right?
Yeah.
So it is interesting. But yeah, ways of getting around it with the last 5 minutes, Dave, for me is this. I've talked about it already, but the first start is vulnerability.
Yeah.
There's something really refreshing around anybody who's suffering from imposter syndrome, just to sit down and have a conversation with someone and say, listen, this is how I feel. I feel like, how many CEOs have we coached who will stand up in front of their organization and they are the strongest person that those people have ever seen, yet they sit in a room with us for 2 hours going, I feel an imposter.
Absolutely.
Well, it's a high percentage of them, right? So actually, for that CEO to come to us and offload in a safe environment for the first time and acknowledge how they feel is the first steps to the resolution.
Yeah,
because the more you hide it, the bigger the fear of getting found out grows. So you have to find a safe channel, a safe space, or a forum, or a colleague, or whoever to say, listen, can I just have 5 minutes? I feel completely overwhelmed here.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's human. It's normal. Vulnerability is the first step towards solving imposter syndrome. What else have you got, Dave, in terms of strategies?
Yeah, I think that's it's a really good one, and I like the term perspective realignment.
Yeah.
Asking others, which of course you've got to do by sharing your feelings and thoughts, but by speaking with maybe 3 or 4 trusted people around you, and that doesn't necessarily have to be people at work. People who are in your life, you care for, and so on and so forth. Just ask them to give you some honest feedback about what they think.
Yeah.
Because it might well be that they say, do you know what? Actually, I was surprised that you took that job because it does feel as though it's a really big thing. So even that little bit of perspective realignment can help. Of course, what we like is that, you've got this is, you've definitely got the experience and skills. You've proven it over many, many years, et cetera, et cetera. But if it's the alternative, that's helpful too.
Yeah.
Because that helps us to think, actually, it's not me being paranoid or, insecure. Actually, there is something to think about here. So then it really helps to start to plan a way forwards rather than just remain in this sort of stasis state, if you like, where we do nothing.
Yeah. I think the third thing on this is what we touched upon earlier, but there's an old African proverb. I put it on social media recently, and it's, if you want to go fast, go alone, but if you want to go far, go together. And I think part of the reason that I quote that African proverb in relation to imposter syndrome is because sharing your burden will help you go far together. So just because you are in a position where you're potentially paid or counted upon to call the shots and make all the decisions and respond under pressure doesn't mean you have to. So get your team aligned with you. The only way you can get your team aligned is to be vulnerable. Once you've been vulnerable and say, listen, guys, I'm sinking, I need help. You watch people step up like you do with me, Dave, and go, what can I take off you, boss? What do you need to give? What do you need to give me for you to come up for air? If you're going to go far, go together. And sometimes I think the biggest misconception, Dave, is that people at the top of the tree suffer from imposter syndrome because they don't share the burden. They carry everything themselves, or because they deem that that's the way a great leader should be. And they don't understand that actually a little bit of vulnerability at times goes a long way. So I think share your burden. If you're going to go far, go together is a big tip from me.
There's a big thing in there about cultural expectations as well, of course, which we see in organizations. And I guess, thankfully, some of those tides are starting to turn. Organizations are becoming more aware of actually it's okay to not be all right today, to have a slower day, to face a challenge that you've not faced before and say, I've not done that before, can anybody help? But it is, I suppose, it's just a glimmer of light that we're seeing at the moment, because there's still an awful lot of organizational expectations, particularly as you climb, career ladders and hierarchies, to be that strong character who can juggle many, many balls all at the same time, who asks for less help because you've been deemed competent enough to give the role to, and so on and so forth. So I guess the thing there about, if you are senior within an organization, just keep checking in with some of your people, keep asking those questions, give them the freedom to demonstrate a bit of vulnerability by prompting, by asking those questions, just checking in on people. We talk about all the time, don't we, Martin, about, everybody just needs to check in on everyone else from time to time, just to see how people are doing.
And just because you're top of the tree doesn't mean you're exempt.
Absolutely.
Right?
In fact, actually, it gives you more responsibility to do those things, not less.
Absolutely. So with a minute left, let me just encapsulate it all, Dave, and we'll finish it up. So imposter syndrome can happen to anybody. We've all experienced it. Ask yourself the question, am I a perfectionist? Is that causing my level of imposter syndrome? Do I have a fear of letting other human beings down, of people down, and is that causing it? Or am I senior or in a position of significant influence where I'm carrying the burden solely on my shoulders and it's all starting to feel a little bit too much? If either of those three scenarios describe you, the first step is vulnerability. Having conversations will open up a dialogue. You need to either delegate, realign your expectations and your perceptions, and do something that allows you to not burden it and all on your own, which will then, be a self-perpetuating cycle and grow. Dave, I could talk to you all day for this, and maybe we come back and do another one. But with 10 seconds left, I'm going to cut it off there, mate. Thank you very much.
You're very welcome.
And no doubt we'll be back shortly with another T2 Hubcast.